So thank you all for attending. My name is Adrienne Minerick, and it is a huge pleasure to be able to introduce Dr. Candy McCorkle. She currently serves as the Vice President of Diversity and Inclusion at Western Michigan University in Kalamazoo, Michigan. And prior to joining the senior administration of Western Michigan University, she served as the Assistant Vice President of Student Affairs and the Director of Diversity and Inclusion at Alma College. In her more than 20 years in higher education, she has served as a faculty member, program director, and assistant dean. Dr. McCorkle has served regional public universities, private liberal arts colleges, community colleges, and taught abroad. So she earned her bachelor's in psychology from Wright State University in Dayton, Ohio, her master's in clinical psychology from Eastern Michigan, and her PhD in counselor education and supervision from Western Michigan. She's been all over the place. Dr. McCorkle has always demonstrated her commitment to moving organizations toward inclusivity. And so today she's going to talk with us about how to effectively advocate for diversity, equity, and inclusion, sense of belonging, and is going to speak specifically to a handbook that she and some other individuals developed for Southwestern Michigan. So Dr. McCorkle, it's all yours.
Okay. Well, thank you and good afternoon. I am such an extrovert. I need to be around people. So I talk with my hands, so just go with me. And I'm going to try to give myself natural breaks so that I can entertain if there are questions. It's really hard to see everybody because of sharing the screen. Adrienne will also be looking in the chat to pull out questions that way as well. And if we do, I will leave time at the end for questions. And if we don't get to everything, I have asked to have the chat sent to me so that I could respond to any question that we didn't get to so that you have information. As was stated, the handbook that I'm basing this off on, it was several diversity practitioners in the public sector and in higher ed in West Michigan. It was put together by Whitney White of Talent 2025. The title is Diversity and Inclusion, 5 Essential Leadership Competencies of an Effective D&I Practitioner. And so this is what I'm basing it on. I'm kind of walking you through the guide, and we actually just finished editing the second edition. So the second edition will be out in January 2022. So one of the first things we have to think about when we're talking about DEI work is you have to ask yourself the individual question of, why do I think this work is important for my organization? Why do I want to be part of this work? The second question is the organization has to ask itself, why do we want to do this work? And DEI has grown over the past 20 years. It has grown exponentially in the past year following the death of George Floyd, where people felt, I need to do something. Well, that's good to step back and ask, why do I want to do something? And what is my capacity to do something so that what you do is actually impactful and effective? And then this role of chief diversity officer, whatever title you want to give the director, the DEI lead on a campus, it is kind of ambiguous. We all can articulate what a president does, what a provost does, what a vice president of student affairs does, what an athletic director does. But when it comes to that chief diversity officer, we're like, I'm not quite sure. And so we have all these ideas. And one of the things that is challenging in this particular discipline is we're still trying to create a set of standards and best practices to say, this is how you define the work of a DEI leader. So there is movement towards that. But each organization right now has to ask itself that question: why? Why do we want to do this work? Why do we think this is important to us? Well, we're going to dive into looking at that a little bit. So when you're trying to develop this work, and this is not just at an organizational level, this is as a practice, as a field, a professional field, there are kind of 4 developmental stages. Most of us are in that framing stage where we're trying to get a sense of what are some things we can do? How do we do this work? We're still trying to conceptualize that. And then we move, while we're in that conceptualizing stage, we also work simultaneously in stage 2, networking. That's where we begin to reach out to people who are doing this work to ask, well, what are you doing? Or how did that work for you? Or what were your results? What did you learn from that? So that we can then figure out what we can adapt, borrow, not use. Well, the field is moving towards maturation. And there are some organizations who have been doing this for quite a while, that they have begun to create a set of standards, a set of best practices. They've assessed, they've vetted them, and these things are working. And so that moves us to that final stage where this as a profession, as a practice, is standardized, where people can clearly define what a diversity officer does. And one of the organizations that is leading this charge is the National Association of Diversity Officers in Higher Education, affectionately known as NADHE. NADHE has developed 12 standards and has adapted those and updated those standards. You can find them on the website for NADHE, which is nadahe.org. And these standards not only help the person serving in the DEI role, it helps the organization understand what this work is about. And so we are slowly moving towards that. So I would assume that most of you are probably in that framing networking stage. And so this is where this guidebook will be very helpful for you. One of the things when we start looking at DEI, we hear these terms and we think that they are simultaneous or synonymous. Diversity, equity, inclusion, they're not synonymous. They mean very different things. And there are lots of terminology that fit under this, but I wanted to talk about the umbrella terms. So the terms that kind of encapsulate this. When we think about diversity, many people will define diversity as representation, as having different folks in an organization. Well, diversity simply means a difference among any and all individuals. That difference can be physical, it can be social, it can be psychological. And we all, regardless of what our race or gender is, come to the table with a variety of diversities. And so that's something that we want to understand. What does this mean? Equity. Equity is a term that we tend to struggle with because we want to use it synonymous for equality, and they are not the same. And we'll talk about that a little later. But equity is being intentional about treating people fairly, having, fair access, opportunity, advancement, combined with an effort to identify any barriers and to eliminate or get rid of or remove any barriers that prevent individuals from fully participating in an organization. So basically, equity is providing each person what they need in order to engage and be successful in an organization. It is not giving everybody the same things, because everybody does not need the same things. For example, as a person who has no hearing impairment, I do not have a need for an ASL interpreter or special equipment to use a computer. Whereas someone who may be hearing impaired may need those things. But if everybody was given an ASL interpreter, it wouldn't benefit me. And so that's kind of what equity is about, making sure people have what they need in order to engage and be successful. Inclusion. Inclusion does not mean, well, see, everybody's here, they're included. That's not inclusion. Inclusion is intentional. It is intentionally creating an environment in which people feel welcomed, they feel supported, they feel respected, and they feel valued. So a good way of looking at that is not only are you able to sit at the table, you have voice at the table, your voice has impact and influence on what is being discussed and helps to shape the organization's response. So that is inclusion. Bias, you hear implicit, explicit bias, but bias in and of itself is simply a proclivity that can be negative or positive toward a group or an individual. We all have bias. Some of those biases, which are explicit biases, those are those biases we are well aware of, that we know we hold. Implicit biases can be shaped by, our own cultural norms within our family, messages that we have received that we're not aware that they're there, but they definitely influence how we engage with people. And the way we are made aware of our implicit biases is when someone calls the question about something we have done or said, and we should then reflect to say, am I being biased? And if so, where is that coming from? And do some investigation. Then there is culture. And culture is simply a social system of shared meanings, beliefs, and customs developed by a group in order to create a sense of community and a means for that group to survive and progress. And we all belong to multiple cultures. We have a work culture, we have a family culture, we have a friend culture, we can have a racial ethnic culture, so we can have a nationality culture. So there's lots of different ways that we see culture. Cultural competency, and I like the word humility versus competency because we're probably not ever going to be completely competent in other cultures, but we can be humble enough to recognize that we're not, but also recognize what we need to know about those cultures. So it's the ability to engage with others in a way that demonstrates that you have knowledge, sensitivity, and appreciation and responsiveness to those other cultures or individuals within those cultures. And then there is cultural intelligence, your CQ. And that is your ability to work effectively across various types of cultures because of your cultural competency, because of your willingness to be equitable, to be inclusive, to be diverse, and to be aware of your biases and manage those biases. So that is how you develop that cultural intelligence. So these are kind of all of the umbrella terms that you need to understand the vocabulary when you're existing in this. Okay, I was trying to see if I saw questions just to make sure I wasn't missing anything. So let's move on and get into the meat of some of this stuff. So earlier you heard me say that organizations struggle with this idea of equity because we have this sense, I'm giving someone else something and not giving someone else something. Yeah, that is what you're doing. You're giving someone what they need and not giving someone else something they don't need. So it is fair. It is just not equal. And I love this graphic because it really, if you're a visual learner, hits home. So the first where you see everyone has the same box. So that is equal, but is it equitable? No, because they're not able to fully engage. The tall person did not need a box. They could already see over the fence. The medium person did need the box, but the shortest person, that box doesn't help them. They're still in the same position they were before they got the box. The next graphic, you now see people getting what they need to fully engage. And then the last graphic is a good example of inclusion because the fence has been removed. So you can be equitable and not inclusive. So this way is inclusive. For me, true inclusive would be they not sit in the grass, but they would be sitting in the stands with the rest of the spectators watching the baseball game. That to me would be true inclusivity. But hopefully this gives you, it's a cute little graphic, but very clear and to the point as to what is the difference between equity and equality. Well, when you start thinking about DEI work, and you remember I asked you at the beginning, you have to ask yourself as an individual, why do I want to engage in this work? And an organization has to ask itself why. Well, this work is very challenging, and it's challenging for a variety of reasons. One of those reasons is it makes people uncomfortable because these are not easy topics to talk about. It means we have to admit things about ourselves. We have to be vulnerable. We have to take risks. These are not what humans like to do. And so, you have to be willing to engage in being uncomfortable. It requires a lot of self-work. In order to do DEI work, you have to do a lot of self-reflection and develop your self-awareness, really think about what you're doing and how what you're doing is impacting things. What are things you might need to change about yourself? What are things you need to learn? What are skills you need to develop? So it requires a lot of work on self before you can really begin to do the work in an organization. It is personal work, relational work, and emotional work. This is not task-oriented or transactional work. This is work where it requires us to engage with one another on very much a personal level and be in relationship with one another. And we have to expose our emotions and figure out how to manage those and move on and acknowledge someone else's, show compassion, be empathetic. It is not what we're used to doing on a day-to-day basis. It requires acknowledging both that there is a business and a moral case for this work. And we're going to talk about, from a business perspective, why should you engage in this work? And also from a moral perspective, because most of it is what is right, because it's acknowledging another person's humanity. The disappointing thing in this work, especially for those of us in higher ed, where we are by nature, many of us achievers, this work is never completed and you never master it. It is an ongoing, continuously evolving work. It requires significant risk, and many of us are risk aversive. We do not want to take big risks because we don't want to fail. Well, you will fail in this work. You will make mistakes in this work, and that's expected. And that can sometimes be disheartening, and people give up on the work because of the risk. And as I said earlier, the work is constantly changing and evolving because we learn more about one another. We learn more about differences, how to incorporate them, how to better engage with one another. So it's never, oh, we have reached, the mountaintop. The mountain continues to grow. So these are some things I want you to think about. Okay, there was agree with work on self. What strategies do you use to refill your cup after challenging interactions that drain your cup? Well, that is where you heard me earlier talk about networking. You not only have networking for ideas, you also have networking to talk about and debrief from the experiences you have. And sometimes you have to sit with that drained cup and think about, wow, why did that drain me? And so sit with it. You always have to do, if you're engaged in DEI work, you have to have self-care, which is you have to know what your capacity is, which is, okay, my cup is, I'm done. I'm exhausted. I have nothing else to give. You may need to walk away, engage in something else, have hobbies, have other activities that you can engage in that revive you, refresh you, so that you can come back to the work. It is very important to have kind of that network of folks that you can debrief. Being a DEI leader on a campus can sometimes be very isolative because not everybody's doing it. And so people don't understand what you're doing. And so you can't just talk to them about it. And they're like, well, I don't get it. And so that's where you have to create that network of people who may not be on your campus. They may be on another campus or in another industry, but they're doing this work so that they can understand. You can talk to that person who gets it, who understands it. You don't have to explain it. You can vent, and they can help to rebuild you so that you can engage. I hope that answered your question. Okay. But self-care is essential to doing this work. Otherwise, you will be burnt out very quickly. And I think as a therapist, I often equate this work with being a therapist. Being a therapist, you become another person's emotional garbage can. You know, that after a while takes its toll on you as well. So you need to replenish yourself. And that's where self-care is important. Making sure you have outlets and activities and supports that help to revive you and refresh you so that you can engage again in the work. Okay, so what is needed in order for an organization to benefit from DEI work? Well, the first thing that is needed is you need competent leaders. Oftentimes, institutions name one person as the chief diversity officer. Well, you need more than one person doing this work. One person cannot do this task by themselves. You need engagement of the whole team, and that means your leadership, middle management, frontline folks. Everybody needs to be engaged in some way. You need diverse team. An institution needs diversity, and diversity is not just racial and gender. It is also in how we think, our worldview, our work style, lots of different ways that we can be different. But the team needs to be built. You can't have everyone the same, otherwise you're not going to progress. There also needs to be an institutional commitment to DEI. And that means not backing down as an institution when it gets a little scary. For example, sometimes DEI work may conflict with what a donor wants, what the board wants, what faculty want. And the institution has to have enough resolve to say, yes, this conflicts, but this is important enough for us to push forward. And if it does not have that, this work does not have a chance to progress and to transform an organization. You also must have a growth mindset, which is not seeing challenges as obstacles or difficulties, but seeing them as opportunities to grow and develop into something new and something different. Inclusive talent selection, which means as you are bringing new people into your team, whether it be employees or students, intentionally trying to be inclusive in how you bring them in and intentionally be looking for talent that does not exist on your campus already. So how can we bring in different things so that we help to develop it? Because if we just keep recycling what we have, that's not very diverse. Also, providing training and development opportunities for people at all levels to learn more about DEI and how they can engage. What happens is you ask people to do this work. Well, most of us aren't going to do something we don't know how, or at least have some idea. And so my thing is, before you ask people to do the work, provide education for them to learn what the work is about. Then that increases the comfort level of being willing to jump in. You'll need to make sure your policies and procedures and processes are equitable. For example, if you have men and women doing the same jobs, making sure the pay is the same. It should not be, and oftentimes that's one of the places we have inequitable pay. We oftentimes also have inequitable advancement and this is more in the business world than necessarily higher ed. But if you play golf with the boss on the weekends, you're more apt to get advanced than someone who may not play golf or who may not be able to play golf because they have other responsibilities on the weekend. But they still should be afforded the same opportunities to advance as someone else. There shouldn't be an advantage given because someone else has a privileged schedule. Organizational infrastructure to support the work, meaning that there is resources-based financial resources, human resources, strategies, so that this can actually move forward. If you are able to really engage in DEI work, and again, you're not going to master it, so it's not about being perfect at it, but engaging in it and being committed to it, what your organization gains, the outcomes of doing DEI work on any organization, whether it be higher ed, business industry, or what, you will see an increase in diversity in the team. There would be an increase in engagement. So folks who saw this as a job are now engaging in other ways in the institution. You will see an increase in retention for higher ed. That's an increase in retention of staff and faculty, as well as an increase in retention in students. Increase creativity, because when you get people in a room that think differently, see things different, have different experiences, those solutions become more creative because there's more things shaping that. Innovation increases because, again, we're challenged to think new ways, look at things very differently. Productivity increases because we want to be where we are. We feel valued, so therefore we value the organization. The climate and the culture improves. There is more of a sense of belonging. People feel included. So they want to be in that environment. And it also improves the overall health of an organization. So these are the things that you gain from doing this hard work. You can gain the work of truly transforming your organization. Okay, this is a long question. Do you have any forms of DEI training that you think particularly effective? Cohort-based DEI hiring training for everyone on search committees, unclear whether that is having desired impact. Are there other forms you think are particularly effective? There are lots of ways to do DEI education. I like to approach DEI education as a scaffold, which means there needs to be some foundational things and then you move up to skills. So I always say one of the first things to do is to do some education that's just focused on awareness so that people become aware, because you don't want to assume where everyone is on their DEI knowledge. So start at the foundational where we just create awareness. Then we move up to developing some fundamental knowledge. For example, understanding identity and privilege, understanding what microaggressions are, understanding implicit and explicit biases and how they shape and impact how we engage, and then helping to develop cultural humility or competencies. So that's that, foundational knowledge. Then you move to training that is focused on application. So how do I apply this knowledge? And application can look different. It's like for faculty, it might be training in how to create an inclusive syllabus, or how to teach in a multicultural classroom, or how to develop assignments that are, inclusive, how to do equitable grading. For staff, it might be a different way of application. So those are some of the differences. Now, when there is search committees, I do strongly encourage search committees have diversity on them. Also, that search committee goes through a training on implicit bias and how that impacts how you review potential candidates, so that you're learning to manage things so that you can see. There are some research studies that have come out that shows when search committees have diversity on them, and often when they are led by or chaired by someone who brings diversity or has a diverse or DEI lens, you tend to have a better candidate pool and more apt to result in a more diverse candidate being hired. Some of the things that you can think about, and this is going beyond training to more of application, is how you write job postings, for example, because that's language we use will attract different candidates. Where we post jobs, how we talk about our organizations at our professional meetings and conferences. All of these things help to shape someone's perception of an organization. So I do hope that this helps. And there are lots of different places and this is why the standardization is so important for us to get to as a profession, because you have lots of trainings happening, but there's no standardization of saying this is what this training should result in. And so that's one of the reasons we really need to move towards that, so that there is consistency and standardization in how we do this work. I hope that answered that person's question. Specific to faculty search committees, I think I addressed that yes. And I think it's for any of your search committees, especially your higher administrative positions, as well as your faculty. Again, if you're truly about becoming an inclusive, diverse, and equitable institution, it starts with, put your money where your mouth is. Are you going to make sure these committees understand what their charge is, what they can do to help this place become more diverse, equitable, and inclusive just by serving on a search committee? And then are you really hiring folks that are different? And different doesn't mean there's another part of that, is you can hire different folks, but you also have to make sure your environment is supportive and prepared for those different folks so that they stay. Because one of the worst things to do is to hire and they leave because the environment is not inclusive or equitable. So making sure your environment is prepared to have those folks come in. Okay, good questions, thank you. Okay, we're going to dive into the 5 fundamental competencies that you should develop as a DEI leader. And this is not just for someone who's serving as the Chief Diversity Officer. This is, I think, for anybody who is engaging in DEI work on in their institution. So the first one is personal characteristics, and we're going to talk about each one individually. The second one is knowledge. The third competency is planning. Leading is the fourth, and communication is the fifth. And it's not like you do this, you do this, you do that. You will do some of these simultaneously in developing them. And Adrian, you have to keep me on the time. Okay, so competency 1 is personal characteristics. These are things that character traits that you should have. These are not necessarily the same as personality traits, but there's personality traits that are related to these characteristics. So the first characteristic is self-awareness. You need to be aware of who you are. You need to be aware of what makes you tick, what are, biases that you hold, how do you respond when you're challenged? You need to be really aware of you and how you exist. Resiliency. You can't do this work if you're not resilient, because you are going to get beat up, kicked, pushed back, because you're making people uncomfortable, so they don't want to see you coming. You are not going to be like the lady with the cookies that everybody wants to see. You're more like the lady with the Brussels sprouts that nobody wants to see. So you have to get used to that. And that requires you to be self-motivated, to believe in what you're doing, to be driven. You have to have a resolve. You doesn't mean that you are unbreakable. As we talked about earlier, self-care is needed, but you have to have personal resolve and be willing to face some of those challenges. You also have to be courageous, brave enough to put yourself out there, challenge others, and invite people in when things are difficult. And you also have to be able to navigate uncertainty. Again, it would be nice if there was a nice say, if you do A through C, you will be diverse, inclusive, and equitable. It's not that easy. It's not a cookie cutter. you really have to adapt this work to each organization. So those are some things you need. Authenticity. It is imperative to be real in doing this work, because if people don't trust you, they're not going to engage in the work. So you have to be humble. You have to be willing to be vulnerable. That does not mean put everything out there. It means showing vulnerability that is appropriate and necessary, not just putting everything about you out on the table. You also have to be open-minded, which is being willing to listen to other things and go, oh, I never thought about that, but we can try it. And also being able to understand that the cost of being authentic in relationships, it can be challenging, but at the same time, it can be rewarding because it can then invite others to be courageous enough to be authentic. You also have to be willing to be a catalyst. So you have to be curious. You have to be innovative and very passionate, because you got to get people hyped and wanting to do this work. So you kind of have to be the, that little spark that sets the flame under other folks to want to engage in this work. You also have to be relationship oriented, which means you have to be willing to collaborate with other people. You have to be seen as approachable, a connector, which means, I laugh because my kids always tease me. They said, Mom, you should be a broker, because I'm always connecting people to things that they need or that they're looking for. If I'm in a store and someone's like, oh, I hear someone talking about, oh, I'm looking for this, and I just saw it in another aisle, I'll tell them, oh, well, it's in aisle 6. So being able to connect people, connect ideas so that people better understand them, connect work so people can see what they're doing connects to what someone else is doing. You also have to have empathy. Again, you have to be willing to meet people where they are. Everyone is not gung-ho and at the top. Some might be willing, but they don't know how to do it. So you have to be willing to meet people where they are and be flexible. You got to be able to pivot, because the work will change. You can't have such a rigid plan that this is what we're doing. Sometimes you're going to have to pivot and change. So when we look at, as I said, personality and characteristics are not the same, but our personality traits can influence some of the characteristics needed to be a competent DEI leader. What I mean by that is some of our personality traits give us a higher tendency to have certain characteristics, but you can develop all of these characteristics, even if it's not your natural tendency. So there are 5 personality traits. And these are, if you've done the Myers-Briggs, if you've done the strengths test, they're kind of based on these 5 traits. So openness, and that is this idea of being open to experiences, being willing to see the world. And openness is strongly connected to the characteristics of authenticity and being a catalyst. Then there is conscientiousness, that person who is always thinking about what they're doing, how they're doing, making sure they're dotting the I's and the T's. And someone who's very conscientious, that is very much connected to self-awareness. And then when we get to extroversion, and the other side of extroversion is introversion, and it's not shy and outgoing. That's not what they mean. Extroversion just means you tend to live externally. Introversion, you're a processor, you live internally. So extroversion, these are folks who are naturally willing to go out and engage with other people. And so extroversion is very much related to catalyst. It also, I didn't put it on here, but it's also related to relationship oriented. Agreeableness. This is, how well can you, kind of that you can show compassion, you can be friendly, that person who people want to be around. And agreeableness is again related to relationship oriented as an orientation, as a characteristic. Emotional stability. And again, the other side of that is instability. And that is a person who knows themselves well, able to manage themselves in various situations. So that is definitely related to resiliency, is also related to self-awareness. So again, these are the personality traits, and they're on a continuum. So you have openness to closed, extrovert, introversion, conscientious, unconscientious, agreeableness, not agreeable, emotional stability, emotional instability. So you have this, continuum, and you can fall different places on those personality traits. And so where you are on those personality traits may give you a natural tendency to have some of these characteristics already, but doesn't mean you cannot develop the characteristics. But in order to do this work, these characteristics are ones that you will have to develop and apply as you are engaging. The second competency is knowledge. So that, retaining information, understanding of things. So a competent DEI practitioner should possess a foundational understanding of the various dimensions of diversity. And so in order to do this, you have to have content knowledge, which means you're going to have to go out and read and learn. And there are training programs to learn about diversity. I will actually send Adrian a list of books that you can read to help increase your knowledge. You can attend webinars. Cornell University has on eCornell, I think it's a 6 or 8 week course on learning about diversity and inclusion. University of Kentucky is one of few, because there's not academic discipline yet. So there's classes on diversity and inclusion, but there's not a comprehensive program on being a DEI practitioner. The University of Kentucky, however, has moved towards that. They have a doctoral program. It's their Student Affairs Administration, but in there's a cognate on being a DEI practitioner. They also have a certificate program for people who already have a terminal degree and don't want to get a second one, but want to be a DEI practitioner. So we're slowly moving, creating more cohesive and standardized trainings. But you need to develop content knowledge. You need to create personal knowledge networks, which means this is where you need to get out and have folks that you can talk to, that you can learn from, that you can share information with. Research DEI standards and best practices. And I said, right now, we don't have here is the actual standard, but NADA standards you can learn. There are other industries that have standards. So you can kind of begin to create standards for your organization. And in order to reach desired outcomes discussed earlier, it is also important to leverage the diversity of your workforce. So you already have folks who have some knowledge. So leverage that to help build this competency of knowledge. When we talk about dimensions of diversity, there's a visual dimension. So this is like skin color, gender, physical ability, accent. You can still be wrong because you can look at someone based on their skin color and assume they're a particular race, and you could be completely wrong. But for the most part, these are things, diversity dimensions we can see. Then there are experience dimensions, these are things we don't become aware of until we engage with someone. For example, their nationality, their language, their age, their culture. And when I say age, you may not ask them their age, but you can tell someone's age typically, or age range, by what they talk about and what their experiences have been. Then there's relational dimension. And this is when you really engage in a relationship with someone where you begin to learn these aspects of diversity, their values, their beliefs, their sexual orientation, their religion, their education, family status or structure, life experiences, work style, worldview, socioeconomic status, relationship status. You don't get those until you truly know the person and you're engaging with the person. You can also look at dimensions of diversity from kind of think about it as a wheel. So you have the internal wheel, the outside, and then the big one. So internal dimension of diversity, those are the things that that's about the person. So their age, their gender, their sexual orientation, those personal aspects. And then there is the external dimension of diversity. And those are, again, very much related to the experience dimension. So it could be someone's geography, someone's educational background, their work experience, their religion, things that other people will experience about them. And then there is the organizational dimensions of diversity, and that is how that person engages in the organization. For example, their status in the organization, where they work in the organization, their work content. So what do they do for the organization, divisions, departments. So again, it's thinking about there's diversity of self, your external diversity, which is what people experience, and then how you fit in the organization. And so these are all, this is knowledge that we all need to have. And we got some more questions. Oh, I skipped competency number 3. Let's go back. So planning. And this is the process of integrating DEI into the vision, mission, and strategies of an organization. And it requires collaboration and support of leadership and the whole team. And some of the things you need when you start thinking about planning is you need collaborative planning process of how do we integrate DEI into the DNA of an organization. So you need lots of people to think about how this happens. It does not just happen by the diversity officer, the diversity lead. It happens by other people looking at how can they take pieces and what this looks like in their area. Using data to assess and understand where the organization is in regards to DEI. And this can be done, climate surveys, staff engagement surveys, looking at just numbers. What are our diversity numbers? How many women, how many people of different ethnicities do we have? You can look at student performance, faculty. So you can look at lots of different matrices to see this. Design, implement, and manage DEI programs and initiatives. So once you assess where you are, start thinking about what are some things we need to help move us forward. It might be some of the training programs. It might be looking at how to develop mentoring programs, how to hire more diverse candidates. It might be how do we create more of a sense of belonging for students. So again, it could be lots of different initiatives that you're doing. It might be an overhaul of policies and procedures. Create a shared DEI culture across the organization. So one of the ways of doing that is, remember one of the first slides that we talked about was vocabulary. So developing a common vocabulary around DEI so that when we are using terms, everyone understands them the same. Instead of if I say diversity, and it means this to me, you say it, it means something different. We may be talking, but we're not talking the same language. So making sure there is a common language, making sure there is clear goals that, here's what we're trying to achieve, making sure everyone understands why we're doing this work. So again, as we are engaging, we're all on the same page. And even though we might be at different levels, everyone is in the pool and nobody knows what the purpose of being in the pool is. So the tools used for planning are creating a vision, creating processes, thinking about your services. What is it we want our services to provide for people? You can create a DEI scorecard, and the DEI scorecard can have lots of things on it. As I said, you can use just demographic information. You can look at how many faculty have been trained. If you include that every course must have a DEI learning outcome, look at how have we achieved that, and do we see our students engaging differently? So there's different ways of doing a DEI scorecard. Having measurable goals and action plans of what you're doing in regards to DEI, and making sure that as you are doing strategic planning, whether it be the whole university strategic planning or as departments are doing their own strategic planning, that it is done with a DEI lens, making sure that we are integrating DEI in that strategic planning. DEI should not be something that's done separate. It should be integrated in every aspect of the organization. Okay, competency number 4 is actually leading the organization in this work. So in order to do this, a DEI practitioner must be able to influence the behavior and the thought of an organization. So things need to do this is they must have business insight, understanding how to, because everybody's not going to go on the moral or the emotional. Some people, it's about bottom line. So how do I, come at people with that information? The other one is political practicality. How do you schmooze with people? How do you know how to play the political game to get folks engaged? The practitioner needs to have the following for leadership to be effective. They have to have the support of the organizational leadership, president, the CEO, whatever type of organization. If it is not supported by the board and the president and senior leadership, it is not going to happen. And it's also important that the DEI person, or at least a DEI person, sits on that senior leadership so they're able to really influence the senior leadership, which then helps to influence the rest of the organization. They must be able to negotiate the level of autonomy that they will need to do this work and make sure it's impactful, which means they can't be under the thumb 24/7. They must have some power to make decisions and make things happen. It is important to gain followers. Again, you can't do this work by yourself, so you're going to have to find other folks in the organization that are going to be champions and influencers. So figuring out who those people are and how do you get them on your team. Engage a variety of stakeholders. And again, in order for this work to be effective, people have to be invested. So you have to engage all stakeholders to help achieve the strategic goals. Also collaborate with partners external to the institution, working with other organizations, other institutions to get the work done. For example, I often will do trainings for organizations or will partner with an organization to bring in a speaker I will sponsor events of other organizations that are DEI oriented so that when I need help, I've developed some partnerships. So these are things that are very important to do. And our last competency, or competencies for continued, things that you need to have as an individual in order to gain trust by the organization. You got to be honest, you got to be fair and consistent. You have to be intentional about building your trust, knowledgeable and competent. If people have a sense you have no idea what you're talking about, they probably won't follow you. And you have to be willing to lead difficult conversations, but not with the purpose of just making people be uncomfortable, but helping them to become uncomfortable and then to learn to move through that uncomfortableness in order to grow and learn and develop a new comfort zone. So you see the little graphic here where he's telling her, quit whining, it's the same distance. Yeah, because his is really easy. She's got all kinds of obstacles in her way. And so it's recognizing that people are experiencing an organization differently and then being willing to address that to them. The last one is communication. And we all know in communication, regardless if you're a DEI leader or whatever you are, if you are in leadership, it is important to be able to articulate your ideas and your goals and your plans to individuals in a way that they can understand it and see themselves as part of it. And communication starts with listening, and not just listening, but listening to understand where the other person is, how they're understanding information, and how they're processing information. And then it is important for you to be able to convey your information clearly. So when you speak, you're able to demonstrate you have understood and heard them, incorporated that. And so now when you respond, it demonstrates that you're clear on your ideas, but you're also understanding their perspective. You also use communication, written form and other, visual aids, making sure that information is able to clearly articulate what it is you're trying to get across. DEI leaders need to be able to gather lots of information and then be able to share that information in a means that is cohesive and coherent. It should never be kind of, just disconnected and discombobulated. It needs to be cohesive so people always see things as being connected. And in order to become a good communicator, one of the things you have to do is be able to communicate with tact, professionalism, and grace. That means people are not always going to communicate with you that way, but you don't have the privilege to not communicate with those things. One of the rules I have when I'm responding to an email, especially if it's an email that's a little testy, I will sit on it for 24 hours. I will send my first response to a mentor or a colleague to say, read this and tell me if I'm going too over the edge. And then I will respond to the person. So that way my response is tactful, professional, and with grace. And with grace is understanding intent versus impact, which is, I don't know the intent when I get an email. I might assume one based on language that's used. So I have to step back and go, okay, let me let go of an intent. But it's also letting the other person understand the impact of their language or their behavior when they don't think about how this might be perceived by someone else. And that's why it's important to use tact and professionalism and grace, because in there you're thinking about intent as well as the impact of what you say and do. You must be able to clearly articulate your vision to show how this is going to help our business. And we talked about how it will help our business. We talked about all those things that increase when you include DEI. Also being able to help people understand the moral benefit of doing this, which is it's what we should be doing because it's probably reflective of our institutional values. And also articulate the imperativeness of this work. You can't make people think this work is just, it's something nice. You have to really show them this is important work. This is essential for our survival as an organization. And you have to kind of come across with that, the immediacy of this work and the urgency of doing this work. Be willing to facilitate difficult conversations on various dimensions of diversity. You're doing this for a couple reasons. One, you want to normalize these types of conversations so the fear and the hesitancy of engaging in them reduces. You also want to have these conversations to create an environment that is conducive for challenge and growth. We all know that in order to grow, you got to have some struggle. It's not just, I can get to the other side without any obstacles. You need obstacles and challenges to help you develop. Another thing is, in order to get people to really engage, it is good to be a good storyteller, to be able to create images and a story that people can be inspired by. It naturally wants them to engage, it educates them, and it connects the dots for them so that I see how this all happens together. So it's always nice to be a good storyteller. And if you don't know how to do that, there are lots of storytelling clinics that you can participate in. So next steps. As a prospective DEI leader, you need to engage in self-assessment. You need to educate yourself on the 5 competencies and see where are you not, where are you on each competency? What do you need to develop? Reflect on what you've learned about yourself through that assessment process, and then begin to create an action plan of how you're going to develop yourself in those different competencies. And then engage in the work of doing the same thing with your organization. So helping them assess where they are, reflecting on it, and then creating action plans and goals for them to move forward. So in conclusion, diversity, equity, inclusion, if appropriately integrated into it and supported by an organization, it can transform the organization. And in order to experience the transformation, it is essential to have a competent DEI practitioner as part of your organization who can guide in strategic planning and promoting DEI and help to prioritize the work. So, oh boy, I'm a little bit over time, and we have some questions in the chat?
There has been a ton of chatter in the chat.
I see.
It would be a good thing, you know, in terms of ongoing discussions after this session. I think there's a ton that can be talked about. We do have some one-on-one sessions following this. We have 1 minute left. If there's one quick question that anyone would like to ask, please go ahead and unmute yourself and ask that question, because much of what's in the chat is ongoing initiatives and efforts here at Michigan Tech. Worth reading, but one question.
And I will let you all know that the guide that I based this on is available for purchase on Amazon. And I think it's $12 and I think 58 cents in paperback. You can also buy it if you have a e-reader. And as I said, the second edition will be out in January.
So the PDF you shared with me, we made available to folks. Did I?
And that's fine. And that's fine.
So there's one question here. Can you recommend a good tool for self-assessment on the 5 competencies?
Well, and that is why you want the guide, because there is one included in the guidebook. And it's an assessment on each of the competency. There is also a guided self-reflection, and then a template for developing your action plan. There are also resources at the end of the guidebook. Some of you asked about training and certification. So there are resources at the end of the guidebook for all of those. And that is not exhaustive. Trust me, you can, but it is, those are ones that we have vetted, so.
Okay, with that, a huge heartfelt thank you for all of your insights, for leading this discussion, being so responsive to everybody. Your one-on-one sessions, all of those should be built into your calendar so you can immediately jump into the dedicated Zoom meetings for those. And if anyone in attendance here has any questions or would like to be put in touch with Dr. McCorkle directly, please email advanced-mtu@mtu.edu and we will get back to you right away. And I will save the chat here and enable it, and I can provide emails of anyone who asks questions if you want to follow up directly.
And I will send you, as I said, a list of readings for folks
Perfect.
who might want to start doing their own self-education. Thank you all. I enjoyed it. And hopefully if it was a benefit to each of you as well.